Hello learners, welcome to the 21st lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century Anglophone novel as manifested in the work of a selected group of women writers. I have been continuing with a somewhat detailed, immersive and somewhat long commentary on the opening sections of Djuna Barnes' Nightwood. I ended the previous lecture with the quote in which Felix and the doctor encountered the expression in Robin Wood's eyes, and the narrator, undertaking a free indirect discourse, described that expression as that of a unicorn with its hoofs raised in the air and manifesting a human hunger, not quite a human, not quite beast, but something in between. I want to talk a little bit about unicorns, what they mean, what they meant in classical, ancient, as well as Christian mythology, and finally, how they've been reinterpreted and the meaning has almost been reversed in contemporary popular culture. And between these two extremes, between these two polarities, how Djuna Barnes's invocation of the image of the unicorn occupies a unique space. So, in popular culture and as well as in literature generally, unicorns signify something very specific about discourses of desire. They also signify something about the desirability of certain kinds of individuals and individuals who bring together unique combinations of class, culture, and identity. Who is desired? Who are considered desirable? What is the logic of that desire? What is the context, the manner of that desire? All that changes by a great deal, historically speaking. But at the center of this, the figure of the unicorn remains something of a constant. So the unicorn first appeared in Western records not as a magical beast, but as an exotic animal described by Greek writers, based on reports from what was then considered to be India. So Greek physicians in the 5th century BC writes of wild asses in India possessing a single horn that was red, white, and black. These animals were noted for their strength and speed. Pliny the Elder and Aelian the Later repeated and embellished these accounts. So the figure of the unicorn is a mythic creature. People have heard of it, but no one has seen it. And in fact, historians and geologists today have established how it's a physical impossibility. Like a creature like a horse or a horse-like creature with a horn in the center of its head simply could not survive, simply could not have existed because it could not have fed itself. Nonetheless, despite all the brilliance in science and anatomy, this mythic creature existed in scholarly writing. And then in the Middle Ages, this unicorn became a profoundly Christian symbol. The single horn was seen as an emblem of Christ's unity and power, but it was also sexualized a lot, and especially in the Hunt of the Unicorn series. It was sexualized because in this narrative, the healing properties of the unicorn's horn could be tamed or could be appropriated by humans only if the unicorn could be hunted. And it could be hunted after it was tamed by a virgin. And usually it was a representation of the Virgin Mary. And so the Virgin Mary is a literal virgin, and the unicorn itself becomes a figure for Christ. And these paintings, which are the series of tapestries known as the Hunt of the Unicorn, often depict the unicorn lying with its head in the lap of this virgin, about to be captured and killed by hunters. This violence, this killing of the unicorn by the hunters, became another allegory for the passion of the Christ, Christ being nailed to the cross and so on. Now, there's an extremely heterosexual, heteronormative, as well as patriarchal bias to these imaginations, and these continue to be reinforced as several individuals found evidence or what appeared to be evidence from archaeology to support these narratives. So actually, narwhal tusks, which were actually the canine teeth of sea creatures, these were mistakenly identified and preserved as unicorn horns in medieval and Middle Ages Europe. Now, these narratives reinforced ideas of purity and often reinforced the moral and religious importance of virginity. So these encounters reinforce the importance of heterosexual modernity and also the importance of virginity in cultures that valued property, inheritance, and so on. So these narratives also reinforced possession and control as the most important values in the hunt of the unicorn. It's also clear that the unicorn is an extremely phallic symbol, and the power of the horn and its purity ties the unicorn's desirability directly to masculine and singular power. So the idea of singularity and uniqueness in this case stands for the rare and the hard to find and extremely scarce nature of the unicorn. But this scarcity was also equated with a very masculine and phallic sense of power. The taming of the unicorn by the virgin was interpreted as a necessary sexualization of a pure force, submitting to the moral authority of unblemished femininity. So, this kind of very, very violent and unequal moral universe seemed to be invoked and reinforced through these ideas and narratives of the unicorn. In contemporary culture, however, fortunately, we are not expected to adhere to all of these narratives of virginity or heteronormativity. In fact, the unicorn has been powerfully reclaimed as a potent symbol in many circles of identity in its various forms, including queerness, nonconformity, and strangeness, or a sort of alignment which does not reinforce normalcy. So, normal which does not adhere to conventional ideas of the normal. Those ideas of normalcy have found an ally and a powerful image in the figure of the unicorn. So, the original cultural meaning of the unicorn as rare and singular has been subverted, and it has been adopted in more inclusive discourses. The unicorn is still singular, distinct, colorful, and powerful, but it is precisely because it does not fit into the established heterosexual or patriarchal orders. It is in this sense that one can find something very powerful going on in this description of the unicorn and the way the unicorn signifies something fluid in Robin Wood's expression, and especially the fluidity that Felix and the Doctor find in Robin Wood's eyes. The unicorn's magical, non-biological status provides a powerful analogy for fluidity in the context of understanding identity. It doesn't adhere to rules that are imposed from outside, and in fact encourages an exploration and an understanding of identity that emerges from the ground up. So, Robin Wood is revived. The Doctor and the Felix go back to have one more drink for the night. And after this, a very strange and in some ways very disturbing turn we find in the conversation. Felix declares to the Doctor that he wants a son, so he will propose marriage, he will initiate a relationship, and with the goal of producing a male heir, and he finds Robin Wood to be an ideal candidate. In response, the Doctor first challenges this idea of Felix, but as soon as Felix begins to defend himself, the Doctor gives another of his typical monologues. So, it's not that the Doctor says that Felix's defense of his desire for a male heir is irrelevant, which is to say, the Doctor does not condone or does not explicitly condone Felix's desire for a male heir and his very violent mode of going about producing a male heir for himself. But what the Doctor says, in a way, both naturalizes this desire and finds an indirect way of exposing some of the hypocrisies and the contradictions inherent in that kind of a desire. So here is what the Doctor says. And this is a very memorable but also a typical monologue that this novel contains, of which this novel contains quite a few. A king is the peasant's actor who becomes so scandalous that he has to be bowed down to. Scandalous in the highest sense, naturally. But why must he be bowed down to? Because he has been set apart as the one dog who need not regard the rules of the house. They are so high that they can defame God and foul their rafters. But the people, that's different. They are church broken, nation broken. They drink and pray and piss in one place. Every man has a housebroken heart except the great man. The people love their church and know it, as a dog knows where he was made to conform, and there he returns by his instinct. but to the graver permission, the king, the czar, the emperor, who may relieve themselves on high heaven, to them they bow down only. So, in a way, the doctor describes how this kind of a desire, this binding of male sexual urge to the desire for a male heir, how that is but a function of the way societies function. Because Felix is who he is, he's bound to have this kind of a depraved desire. There is very little that Felix can do or change by way of his individual actions, which will allow him to change what has been set in stone for him. This is one. But then, by describing the deterministic logic of how Felix feels what he feels and why he will do what he wants to do, the doctor also exposes the hypocrisies. So, and he does it through these images, very powerful images which the reader is invited to unpack. And not just images, they're actually analogies because different metaphors are combined together. They're combined and compounded. So the first is that of between the king and the peasant. So some individuals in all societies have to play by certain rules, but those rules don't apply to others. So this is a universal description of social inequality and how such social inequality produces different structures of feeling in different individuals. And then he describes the difference between the king and the peasant in terms of the difference between pets who are trained to perform different bodily functions in different spaces. So there are some dogs who need not regard the rules of the house, that they are so high that they can defame God and foul their rafters. So far so good, because it seems to be a straightforward equivalence between privileged individuals in society who don't have to play by the religiously ordained rules of desire and sexuality. But then the doctor complicates this image and invites readers to think critically. The people, that's different, the doctor says. They are church broken, nation broken. Now, these expressions, church broken, nation broken, echo the expression housebroken. Housebroken means pets who are trained not to relieve themselves inside the home, but to go out or at least signal to their owners or parents that they must be taken out. And this is a very important part of training pets. And here the doctor uses this expression as a way to describe how individuals are robbed of their agency and how maybe they willingly give up their freedom. And the example here is that individuals may be church broken and nation broken, but they still find ways of performing their functions. That is, they find ways of fouling their rafters. And then the contradiction is that people love their church and know it, as a dog knows where he was made to conform, and there he returns to his instinct. So the idea is that people don't see this contradiction in their lives, and they are willing to live with these contradictions when they find other human beings break the rules. So people are very keenly observant of these rules when it comes to animals. That is, they are very eager to train their pets in order to maintain these boundaries, boundaries of propriety, cleanliness, etc. But when it comes to other people, human beings are quite willing to ignore and forgive other human beings who take liberties and who break those fundamental, very essential rules of propriety. And the response to this, from the perspective of Felix, is described thus. The Baron, who was always troubled by obscenity, would never, in the case of the doctor, resent it. He felt the seriousness, the melancholy hidden beneath every jest and malediction that the doctor uttered. Therefore, he answered him seriously. To pay homage to our past is the only gesture that also includes the future. So this sentence, to pay homage to our past, is the only gesture that also includes the future, is a very typical expression. It confirms what we have read and understood about Felix so far. Felix holds on to the idea of the past because it allows him to carve out a decent, dignified existence in an extremely anti Semitic world. So, whatever Felix says about tradition, it is less of his actual belief and more of what he wants to be seen and perceived as believing. So, it is in this very convenient way of appearing to believe something that Felix is able to accept the doctor's critique of his own abuse of privilege and his own blindness to the essential and fundamental laws that might have ensured a democratic and egalitarian existence. Now, after this, two things happen. So there's courtship and marriage, there's the conception of the child, the period of pregnancy, there's the birth of the child, there's estrangement. At the end of the novel, we finally understand why it's called the somnambule, because we see Robin walking, and this justifies the title of the sleepwalker. So the period of the courtship is marked by descriptions of Felix's view of history and his discovery of ideas different from his own, of both history as well as his discovery of Robin's ideas of fashion, history, and society. So when Felix first takes Robin on a tour of Europe to see some of the historical sites, the spaces, sculpture, and the culture of Europe, he finds something very unique. He finds that Robin's taste reminds him of a very specific image, and here is how it's described. I will read. He was surprised that often her taste, turning from an appreciation of the most beautiful, would also include the cheaper and debased with an emotion as real. When she touched a thing, her hand seemed to take the place of the eye. And further, her fingers would go forward, hesitate, tremble, as if they had found a face in the dark. When her hand finally came to rest, the palm closed as if she had stopped a crying mouth. So, again, extremely intricate images and also deeply disturbing, but also very fleetingly described images. And although it's quite fleeting, it remains quite unforgettable. The way Robin's hand moves, Felix sees the hand as if it were calming or keeping from crying further someone's mouth who was crying. Now, Felix's description of Robin's clothes is described with this very telling phrase. It's called newly ancient. Now, at this time, we also understand that Felix's love or so-called appreciation, affection, or whatever it is that he declares is extremely deterministic. And here is how the narrator describes it. He found, that is, Felix found, that his love for Robin was not in truth a selection. It was as if the weight of his life had amassed one precipitation. He had thought of making a destiny for himself through laborious and untiring travail. Then with Robin it seemed to stand before him without effort. When he asked her to marry him, it was with such an unplanned eagerness that he was taken aback to find himself accepted, as if Robin's life held no volition for refusal. So it's a strange sentence and somewhat counterintuitive. So we're told that when Robin accepts, Felix is taken aback, and it's because Robin's life held no volition for refusal. If Robin's life held volition for refusal, that is when the acceptance would be surprising or would take Felix back. But nonetheless, this is the counterintuitive nature of interpersonal interactions and the way the narrator invites us to think deeper and further about human psychology and about the motivations and the forces that inspire people to act in the way that they do. Now, Felix tries to educate Robin. The first stage in Felix's education of Robin is an empirical positivist history. That is, get knowledge, be transformed. This is my description of empirical history. But soon this phase or this stage is very rudely and roughly interrupted because Felix realizes that it cannot work or it's not sustainable. Instead of an empirical positivist history, what we get or what we see in Felix's education of Robin is a critical materialist approach to history. In this approach, information is not enough, true knowledge is required, and true knowledge produces with it an overwhelming pressure. Knowledge comes with a responsibility to undertake a deep effort, to exert a will to transform one's body and mind in the way that the past and the future demand. So, a true knowledge of history requires an awareness of the ethical dilemmas, of the complicity that one is always placed in with regard to the violence and the injustices that were done in the past. So, this ethical awareness of historical violence is something that's an important part of true historical knowledge, and it requires that one opens oneself up to the ethical demands of people who have gone before and people who are yet to arrive. Those of you who have read Marxist theory, and especially the writings on historiography and historical materialism by early 20th century Marxists, will find in this description that I have just given of a critical materialist history the echoes of the writings of Walter Benjamin, who's written about history in multiple texts, but most famously in the text, The Angel of History. And it is this bidirectional gaze which is quite important for Benjamin, and especially the gaze which produces an ethical imperative in every act of historical knowledge. The knowledge of past suffering, the knowledge of solidarity that emerges through suffering, and the hope of change in the future, which would help establish an egalitarian world in which there would be less of that suffering and violence. They were roughly contemporaries, Walter Benjamin and Djuna Barnes. They were all products of the intellectual, social, and cultural changes that were unfolding across Europe in the early 20th century. And I encourage those of you who are that way inclined to explore this comparison in different projects through different writings and research projects of your own. So in the first stage of this education that Felix provides to Robin, and I'm using the word education in ironic sense, Felix takes Robin to Vienna. Vienna is an important city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's a city that was marked by, on one hand, the decline of great 19th century empire, a great 19th century empire, the Austro-Hungarian dynasty, but also simultaneously as this empire was being destroyed, we also witnessed a great deal of revolution, aesthetic, cultural, social revolution. So it is famously known as the site of decadence. Decadence refers to the decline of great empires. So it has a sense of decay and a sense of something in the last stages of a process of dying. This is the first meaning of decadence. Decadence also, however, has the connotation of a great deal of experimentation, innovation in artistic forms and styles. Finally, decadence also refers to the exploration of new forms of identity, and especially the challenge and the rejection of deeply restrictive modes of gendered identity. The decadence is associated with thinkers such as Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was famously tried for obscenity and sentenced to prison. But in addition to Oscar Wilde, there were several others who very powerfully undertook this kind of radical questioning of what identity meant. And so the choice of Vienna as the place where Felix takes Robin and where he aims to provide a cultural education is not incidental, and it is quite telling. But there's a twist here. The success that several other writers found, or several other creative practitioners found, is something that eludes Felix. So what happens there exactly? He takes Robin to palaces, gardens, and other sites of great cultural importance with the hope that she would be moved by the power and the glory of Europe as he was. So at one point he tells Robin, "You are a baronin now." He spoke to her in German as she ate the heavy schnitzel, and I'm reading now from the novel. He spoke to her in German as she ate the heavy schnitzel and dumplings, clasping her hand about the thick handle of a beer mug. He says in German, and I'll read the translation, "Life is eternal and therein lies beauty." So there's a great deal of reference to German core cultural ideals, texts, and, and also the sense, the evocation of the brand of European aristocracy as being quite attractive to an American. And the stereotype that's being reinforced here is that Americans don't have that rich or that old an idea of civilization, which Europe has. Americans have material wealth, they have comfort, they have money, but they don't have that deep sense of resonant history that Europeans have. And that is what Felix is trying to give Robin a sense of. Now, stage one leads to stage two at a particular moment in the imperial palace where Felix has been talking about Emperor Francis Joseph and Charles I. And there's a sudden moment of realization in which Felix realizes that he has made a mistake. And here is how Felix realizes it. I will read this long passage and then stop. As he spoke, Felix labored under the weight of his own remorseless recreation of the great generals, statesmen, and emperors. His chest was as heavy as if it were supporting the combined weight of their apparel and their destiny. Looking up after an interminable flow of fact and fancy, he saw Robin sitting with her legs thrust out, her head thrown back against the embossed cushion of the chair, sleeping, one arm fallen over the chair's side, the hand somehow older and wiser than her body, and looking at her he knew that he was not sufficient to make her what he had hoped. It would require more than his own argument. It would require contact with persons exonerated of their earthly condition by some strong spiritual bias, someone of that old regime, some old lady of the past courts, who only remembered others when trying to think of herself. He realizes, and then he tells Robin, "I am deceiving you." I will continue with the commentary in the next lecture, but for now, I just want to say that this is a realization that replicates many of the values of the decadent turn of the century, but also with a very powerful twist. So the company that the two of them require in order to become truly worthy of each other is not the company that they find in each other's persons. That is, they are locked in a flawed and fatal relationship. This is a realization that comes to both of them, although they don't act on it immediately. And the realization that Felix has is that instead of his company, what would be most suitable and deserving from Robin's part is the identity of people who are less bound to their earthly existence. And that is not merely a spiritualism or a religious sense, but rather a willingness to question the identities, the bodies that one was locked into by the accident of one's fate. What is that group? Where can they find that community? They will find that community in Paris, in that community of people who worked in circuses, people who took on the names of royalty, but who were actually actors and who were performing roles. So it is again, we return again and again to that idea that in order to survive the bruising, the erosions, the acid, corrosive nature of modernity, individuals need to find solidarity. And they can find solidarity among people who have rejected more of the comforts of modernity than they themselves have had the courage to reject. So I will continue this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you for now.